Thanks for inviting me to present this paper. In the meantime, about 1 month ago, I moved back to the Banco of Italy, so that's the new affiliation that you have here. It's a pity that we cannot be all together in Chile right now, but I hope that we'll be able to see each other in person anytime soon. So thanks for letting me discuss this paper. Let me move directly to the discussion. I will summarize a little bit the contributions of the paper and then the main findings, and then I have basically just 3 points. The paper, I think, is already forthcoming, so I did not focus my discussion on the exact results of the paper, but more on some of the interpretation of the results that we have in this paper, more generally what we can do and what I think we cannot do with counterfactuals in technical regressions. So the main contributions of the paper, I think one great contribution at the very beginning I will mention is the fact that there is a detailed account of SPR aims and use. So before reading the paper, I didn't know much about it, and it's good that there is now a paper in this literature, so in the academic literature, that explains exactly what SPR is and how it is used and how it works. From a technical point of view, the workhorse model behind this work is the Murphy 2014 model, which is enriched with the SPR shocks. And there are 3 different models. One in which SPR does not respond within demand to other shocks in the global oil market. There is model 2 in which the global oil market variables do not respond within demand to SPR shocks. And then there is model 3, which is more general in a sense there is unrestricted feedback between SPR and the rest of the model. And then there are some technicalities that are discussed in the paper. So how to draw zero-sign narrative restrictions when shocks have a block recursive structure. I think this is very interesting, and I will discuss it a bit this point later. And then some useful reminders. So when you have set identified VRs, then you have to compute var objects first, for example, cumulative effects of shocks for each row, and then compute statistics of interest, like, for example, a median. But I look forward to reading the new paper that Lutz mentioned with Inwe on how to do inference in this kind of vector regressions. So the main findings. Finding number 1, SPR shocks affect oil prices, but their effect is quantitatively small. SPR shocks explain 55% of SPR variation. Now the question arises, is this very little or is it a lot? So at the beginning I thought that it was quite a lot, in the sense that I expected the SPR, so these strategic reserves, to be used strategically to stabilize the price of oil depending on market conditions. So I expected, in a sense, the policy rule, or the predictable part of this policy rule, to explain most of this variation of SPR. But in fact, as Lutz has explained quite clearly, these SPR interventions typically follow exogenous shocks, so hurricanes or natural disasters, which are strongly unpredictable. So there's a lot of variation that is explained by these shocks. And then the other result that we'll discuss is that different episodes of SPR release have mixed results. So, for example, when you look at drawdowns, they have different results from exchanges. So these have different impact on the market. And then there is an evaluation of the projected fiscal revenue of this plan, the 2018 White House proposal to sell off half of the reserves in the next 10 years. So the fiscal revenues expected by the White House with this proposal are very much consistent with the results obtained from the model, but the model, of course, also gives some uncertainty around the median estimate. So my points, I will discuss 3 points. One is computational challenges, models, and data. So as Lutz has already explained, one of the models is discarded by the data because there's no way to estimate it. But my question to him and my questions to us is really, how do we need to interpret this kind of results, or these episodes, when you have a general model that you cannot estimate. The second point is, can this VR really tell us something about drawdowns and exchanges? I think that in order to really draw a conclusion about the difference between these 2 different policies, we need to look at 2 different shocks rather than looking at the same shock. And then I will make a point about structural scenarios and long-term fiscal plans. So let me move to my first point. So the paper considers 3 different models. Model 1 and Model 2 are pretty restrictive in the sense they have 4 zero restrictions. Model 1 seems to be consistent with the theory, so with the theoretical model, and it also seems to make sense in the sense that if these SPR interventions really are a reaction to natural disasters, then you can really think that there's no impact within the month of these releases on other global oil market variables, so prices and production and overall inventories. Model 2 is a bit more restrictive, I think, in terms of economic interpretation. Then there is Model 3. Model 3 has no zero restriction. So we know from the theory, we know from a number of papers by Ramirez, Arias et al. That zero restrictions are pretty severe restrictions, so they strongly restrict the space of models that are admitted. So in theory, you would expect models 1 and model 2 to be harder to estimate than model 3. But model 3 does not find support in the data and is discarded as implausible or at odds with reality and with the data. But why is this the case? So let me just go a little bit into the technicalities that are in the paper and that Lutz didn't have time to go through, so it's good that I put the slide here. So there is, in a sense, a trick. This is not a trick, but there is one simplifying computational aspect of models 1 and model 2. And so these two models have a block structure, block diagonal structure, well, block structure, not block diagonal. So let's define C as the structural impact matrix. So this is really the matrix that defines the impact of shocks within the month on the endogenous variables. And I have divided it into different blocks. So the matrix C, which is an n by n matrix, has a square block on the top left-hand side here, C11. Then this is a column vector, n minus 1 times 1. This is a row vector, so it's a long vector, and this is a scalar. So you can just simplify it in this way. Then orthogonalize the covariance matrix of the vector of regression as follows. So this is very standard, C, Q, Q prime, C prime, where Q is a rotation matrix. Now, Model 1 in the paper is obtained by setting this row vector to 0. So this is the zero restrictions that tell us the SPR shocks have no impact that the rest of the model does not respond within the month to SPR shocks. To have Model 2, you need to set to 0 this column vector instead. Now, if you do this, then the nice result is that you can specialize the rotation matrix Q to have this form, so to be block diagonal. And this really simplifies computation because now you have to rotate a matrix Q bar, which is smaller than big Q, and this, in a sense, makes it possible to estimate a bit more easily Model 1 and Model 2 compared to Model 3, even though in theory Model 1 and Model 2 put more restrictions or more severe restrictions on the space of admissible models. So what is the point I want to make can we really conclude that Model 3 is not supported by the data? I think that Model 3 is this result is really a computational issue. So perhaps in 10 years' time, the 60 billion draws that Lutz was able to do to try and estimate Model 3 will become easily, I don't know, 600 billion or even more, and perhaps more general models will be easier to estimate. But so the conclusion we can draw from this kind of results is not, I think, that these models are at odds with the data. They are more general models are just simply sometimes harder to estimate. Point number two, sorry, exchanges and drawdowns. So the paper revisits a number of episodes in which SPR was either released or temporarily lent out. So these are called exchanges. So exchanges are interventions in which reserves are first released, but with the idea they're going to be replenished. So they're lent out and they need to be repaid back with some interest in kind. The results in the paper are that most releases have a limited effect on prices, while the 2000-2004 oil exchange had a sizable, although temporary, effect on the price of oil. And the conclusion is that there is a systematic difference in the way exchanges and drawdowns affect prices. My point here is that the effects of these interventions are based on the historical decomposition, so on the cumulative contribution of the shocks to the historical decomposition. If I understand correctly how this is done in the paper, Lutz can correct me if I'm wrong. So take the structure vector regression moving average representation, set to 0 all the SPR shocks before and after the intervention, and then you look at the change in the price of oil during the intervention period. That's really the effect of the intervention. But so if you use this strategy, can you really tell apart a systematic difference between exchanges and drawdowns? And my answer is I don't think so, in the sense that the moving average representation of this var is just the sum of shocks times impulse response functions. But the impulse response functions are the same for exchanges and drawdowns because these are the same shocks. So the only difference is the realized shocks. But I don't think you can really distinguish between these two strategies by looking just at one shock. I think this is clear if we look at the language, if you look at the paper where this is explained really clearly. So an exchange agreement involves an initial drawdown of strategic reserves, which is followed by a subsequent rebuilding of stocks as oil is being returned. In contrast, an emerging drawdown in response to the disruption of oil involves one or more releases over time. So this looks like talking about two different shocks to me. In a sense, one is fully unanticipated, so the SPR release is fully unanticipated. An exchange by itself builds an expectation that this drawdown is going to turn into an addition at some point in time. So it sort of builds an expectation. So anticipation effects, which are not important in the case of SPR shocks, pure SPR shocks, perhaps are important in the case of release. And in nature, it seems very similar to me to the difference that we make when we look at monetary policy shocks between pure monetary policy shocks and forward guidance. So there is an expectation component that you're shocking when you do an exchange that perhaps needs to be modeled in the model and identified as a different shock. And this is my last point that I think it's related to the former. So the evaluation of the White House policy plan falls into the category structural scenario analysis. There is a very recent paper by Antonio Diaz, by Ivan Petrella, Ruben Ramirez. Ivan will present more here in this conference, although a different paper. This is forthcoming in GME. Now, when you look at very long-term plans, which are announced in advance, I'm not sure that you can treat these as a sequence of SPR shocks, like, for example, the sudden release of SPR following a hurricane. So anticipation effects also in this case, I think, are likely to play a role, and perhaps one could try and model anticipated shocks. So in this paper that I mentioned, what they do is they, for example, try to use a structural VR to evaluate the possibility of moving from a monetary policy regime to a different one, in which, for example, the Fed uses a make-up strategy to make up for past unsuccessful attempts to simulate inflation, and they try and model this as a sequence of anticipated shocks. And I think it's a good idea, and perhaps this kind of long-term fiscal plans can be modeled and evaluated with the same philosophy. The last point is really nitty-gritty, but perhaps in the future it's useful to have in mind this statistical detail, that the possibility of the scenario. Let's talk about this. I think the figures in the paper are pretty uncontroversial, in the sense that the sequence of counterfactual shocks that they need to build up this scenario are really small. So they don't seem to be a problem in the sense of the Lucas critique. But there's also another way to do this more formally. So in this paper, there is a plausibility statistics, which is related to the modesty statistics proposed by Lieber and Za in 2003. This is based on the divergence of the counterfactual shocks distribution from the historical distribution, and this can be assessed can be used to assess such scenarios. So to conclude my discussion, great paper. I enjoyed a lot reading it. I'm totally convinced that SPR shocks are exogenous with respect to the global oil market. I'm not sure that exchanges shocks can be treated in the same way, or that policy plans to draw down half of reserves in the next 10 years can also be looked at in the way we look at SPR shocks. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thank you, Fabrizio. Now, Lutz, you can answer to the discussion.
Yes. So the first question was whether the 55% in the variance decomposition explained by policy shocks is little or a lot. The way to think about that is that in the past, people have written papers about this. They made assumptions such that 100% here is explained by the policy shock. And so relative to that benchmark, you could say, well, 55% is news, right? It's different. So whether you think this is a little or a lot may depend to some extent on where you're coming from. There are some people who believe that the SPR is fully endogenous, and there's some people who believe, the majority probably, that it's fully exogenous. You suggested that the model with zero restrictions is more restrictive than models with sign restrictions. That is not in general true. In my structural VR textbook with Helmut Lütgepohl, we explain in detail why that is not in general true. Moreover, the fact that model 3 fails has nothing to do really with the sign restrictions or the zero restrictions directly. It has to do with the narrative restrictions that we're imposing on the model. So if you just estimated the model with the sign restrictions, of course you get lots of solutions. And the solutions actually look quite reasonable. They don't look very different from the other models. Where the model has trouble is with the narrative sign restrictions. Now, I agree, hypothetically, with more computing power, maybe one would be able to generate some solutions. We at some point had to give up. We tried hard, right? In fact, I kind of like that model, ex ante going in, but we just couldn't find any solution that worked. Now, about the exchange arrangement, you suggested that there would be a forward-looking component. That's not as clear-cut in reality because in many cases, the Department of Energy isn't very clear about when the oil has to be repaid. So there's some uncertainty about that where they have shifted deadlines. So you can argue that the positive shocks that occur late in that sequence after the initial shock, which certainly was a surprise, also could be considered at least in part a surprise. But I'm sympathetic to your point that there is a gray area there about whether that might or might not be anticipated. About the White House proposal, yes, I showed you a single realization of the shock sequence, but I also wrote that this is a representative single realization, meaning you could have looked at virtually any other one and would have looked the same way. The key point about the White House proposal is whether you, as the White House coordinator or the guy working for the Department of Energy, tell the public when and how these SPR oil releases will occur or not. In other words, do you share the shock sequence with the public or not? If you don't share it with the public and keep the public guessing, then it doesn't seem so unreasonable to me to think of the actual shock as a surprise to the public. Again, I agree that after a certain amount of oil has been released, that narrows down the range for subsequent releases. So there is gray in this discussion, but it's not as clear-cut that this wouldn't make sense because everybody can anticipate it. So thanks a lot for the great comments.